Hello, everyone, and welcome to what is technically part two of our lecture on chapter 12, but it's the only part of our lecture on chapter 12 in week 6. So, we covered part of chapter 1 in an earlier module, but in this section of chapter 12, what we're really going to be focusing on is how you analyze data in a qualitative study. So, what type of data analyses are available to you, and how you might approach data analysis in a study. So, also, I'm just realizing that apparently my internet connection is slow, so hopefully my subtitles pick back up. I apologize if they don't. So, let's get started here. When it comes to analyzing qualitative data, honestly, qualitative data analysis can be challenging. There are so many different aspects that come into play when it comes to qualitative analysis that can really change very drastically how we do the analyses that we do. And part of that is because researchers as a whole in qualitative studies have attempted so many different times to come up with systematic ways to handle qualitative data, but the analytical process can still be fraught with difficulty because each researcher in qualitative studies is as unique as their study, which means that the analyses that they choose to run can be vastly unique and variable depending on their study. But even though there is this variation and there is these differences across researchers, in qualitative analyses, when they're conducted correctly, qualitative studies, researchers should correct for any individual differences they have as researchers and really strive to bring out the best possible interpretation of their results. And that's how we get to a point of sort of approaching standardization in qualitative research, is saying, okay, yes, I may be an individual and I may be different from another qualitative researcher, but here is how I'm going to account for my individual differences and being able to draw out meaningful conclusions about my data and meaningful interpretations of my data. So, one of the ways that you can start to look at data in a qualitative way or to think qualitatively is by looking for patterns. And recognizing patterns is one of the first ways that qualitative researchers really start to interpret their data. And they do so by looking for similarities in very specific areas. And honestly, looking for patterns or recognizing patterns in qualitative data is one of the first steps in qualitative research because we just look for patterns in our worlds naturally as human beings. We like to follow patterns from what we do every day, from when we wake up to when we go to bed, to even just like personal patterns in the ways that we operate in the world. Do you grab your toothbrush with your right hand? Do you grab your toothbrush first or do you grab your toothpaste first? Like that's a pattern, and we notice those patterns in our lives just naturally. So, looking for patterns and recognizing patterns in qualitative data is a natural first step. And we start by looking for similarities in specific things. So, one of the common areas in qualitative research is looking for similarities in the actions that our participants engage in. Are there similarities in the ways that our participants behave that we can say is some sort of conclusion that we can draw about the work that we're trying to observe or the meaning that we're trying to draw from it? We can also look for patterns in the words that people use, how they describe things, what they actually say, the words that come out of their mouths can show patterns in our data that we can draw meaningful conclusions from. We can also look for similarities in events of our data. So if you have specific events that you're observing in your qualitative data, you can look for similarities in those events to be able to draw conclusions. But we can also look for similarities in feelings. And this will give us insight into some of that internal perspective of our clients and really sets the stage for us to be able to better understand meaningfully as a whole what our qualitative data looks like when you account for every participant that you've talked to and all of the data that you have collected from them. And once you've looked for patterns, one of the next things that you do as a qualitative researcher is you start to code data. And at the start, coding involves removing any extraneous information in our study and really trying to keep just the information of value. And one of the ways that we do that is through categories. We create categories that allow us the opportunity to say, okay, here's the meaningful stuff and here's the extraneous stuff that I can just get rid of. Our textbook has a really good example of this, and it's kind of silly, but it actually is really effective. So when you're talking about creating categories in qualitative data, it's pretty close to what we talk about if you're ever cleaning an incredibly messy room. A lot of times when you're cleaning a messy room, you might start by just creating piles of stuff, distributing things into categories that make sense, that are grouped naturally together, that we can then say, okay, all of these items are similar to one another into some larger category. So you might say, okay, all of this is clothing, all of this is makeup, all of this is sports gear, all of this is hats, like whatever it is. You create these broad categories and you just throw things into the categories and say, okay, once I have all the clothes in one area, then I can organize those into more detail. And categories is similar in qualitative data in that oftentimes you have a lot of data that you're combing through and you want to be able to do a deep dive into it, but you have to start by throwing the variables into meaningful categories that are related to these larger categories so that we can start to see how different participants approach the same topic of interest. If we are looking at a study in a community of maybe it's community responses to COVID-19, we can start to create some pretty large categories and say, like, okay, yeah, everyone is exposed to the same stimulus, COVID-19, but we're seeing these vastly differences in categorical behavior. Some groups were like, yes, I loved it. Some groups were said it was the worst experience of my life being home. And some people were like, yeah, it sucked at first. And then I got used to it and I found a new routine and we made it work. Like we start to see these larger categories that help us to really understand what's going on in our research. But we can also use categories to start searching for frequency in our data. So, frequency plays an important role in qualitative analysis because the repetition of a topic or a concept may be meaningful. And I think it's really fun because a lot of times when we think about frequencies, we're really talking about numbers. How many people selected this answer option? And that is almost always directly associated with quantitative research. But we also use it in qualitative research to draw meaningful conclusions about the majority of participants, where their answers fall, and using that almost as like a measure of central tendency in qualitative data. And also, when you're doing qualitative data, you have to consider diversity. Since diversity is a part of the world that we live in, our continued awareness of diversity will result in better studies, better investigation, and much better results and discussions. So, if you're doing a qualitative study, this is less of a data analysis step and more of a perspective that you take as a researcher. It is your responsibility to go into a study remembering and taking into account the diversity of the human experience and the human identity, and making sure that in the way that you are conducting research, that you are talking about the research, you are accounting for that diversity instead of minimizing it. And that is one of the major priorities of qualitative data analysis, is making sure that you're taking into account that component of diversity and honoring it in the way that it deserves to be honored. But also, there are many cases where in qualitative research, we have to remember our past. So there are many cases when our past experiences or personal histories or other types of data in our background will influence both our participants, their impact to responses, but also our work as researchers, how we interpret information, how we have observed people. We all come to that through our experiences in our past, whether that be our personal history, our educational history, our values, our beliefs, whatever it is. And we as researchers need to take into account as many elements as we can when analyzing data, because only through taking into account these pieces can we really get a high quality result in our data analysis and create a stronger study. So sometimes the way that this works is directly calling out in qualitative analysis that our interpretation as researchers is largely influenced by the biases that we hold, our identities, and the lens through which we view the world. Being upfront and honest about that, in that it does influence our studies, and we have to take that into account. And also, when you are conducting qualitative research, it is imperative that you think theoretically. So, when we're talking about thinking theoretically in qualitative analysis, that means that you're going into your study while considering theories. You're doing that while you're analyzing your data so that you can, as a researcher, interpret the information of your study in a meaningful way and make necessary connections between the material of your study, the results of your study, and the larger theoretical concepts. So, understanding what theories are out there for understanding the world around us and having language to express what people experience. So, maybe that's things like the minority stress model or whatever it might be, because it's so dependent on your study. But you're going into your study and your data analysis with that theory in mind so that you might be able to use that to build connections between your material and the larger world to which your study applies. And thinking theoretically is related to thinking critically, which is the ability to look at something from multiple perspectives and to change our usual ways of thinking. And when it comes to qualitative data, thinking theoretically and thinking critically are some of the most key components of the data analysis. And similar to the component of diversity and remembering the past, thinking critically and thinking theoretically are less specific data steps in qualitative studies and more or less a lens that we have to take when viewing our study. So when we say that you need to think critically, you really need to, as a researcher, go into a study with an open mind and say that anything is possible. Challenge the way that you naturally think about things, challenge the natural conclusions that you want to draw, and really look for information that could be contrary to that. Sometimes in qualitative data, there's actually some research that says the best approach that you can take to qualitative data is going in having absolutely no idea of what's going on or why it's occurring, because that opens the door for you to understand and really challenge yourself to say, maybe it's something completely innovative, something that we've never looked at before, and that's why I don't understand it. And research supports that it's when we go in with absolutely no understanding of what's going on that we sometimes have the biggest breakthroughs in qualitative research. So you might be asking yourself, like, okay, Patrice, you've talked about like these general lenses that we're supposed to take, but you really didn't talk about any analyses that you're supposed to do in qualitative data. And that's on purpose because the analyses that you run in qualitative data is so unique to the study that we honestly can't talk about it. The way that we talk about qualitative data analysis is through these perspectives and saying, like, there are these general lenses and really these things that you need to take into account while you're doing qualitative data analysis. But then the actual data analysis plan is very unique to your qualitative study, which can sometimes be a little bit daunting because you go into the study completely open minded and then you get the research and you really have to pave your own path. And it just sort of depends on the researcher in which perspective they want to take. So I know that this isn't like, here's the specific analyses that you will run, But I hope this gives you insight into the vast differences between quantitative and qualitative studies and really the benefits that both have in our way of understanding variables about our world. So that's where we're going to wrap up our lecture on chapter 12. I will see you all in the next lecture.